Today, we are absolutely delighted to have a presentation on the DAC scaling guidelines. For those who don't know, and Ben Klump in a minute will say more, the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, is part of the OECD, which is an organization of member states from Europe, North America, Asia, and a few other places that works cooperatively to develop and share information and knowledge about good practices in governance and government practices. Today, the DAC and Ben and two colleagues from Swiss Agency for International Development and Cooperation and from the Belgian agency Enable will be presenting on scaling guidance, which they developed and really over the past year in 2024 and released about 6 months ago. We couldn't be more delighted to have the three of them today, as the DAC is extremely influential, not only among its members and bilateral donors, but its monitoring and evaluation guidelines are widely shared and used as the basis for monitoring and evaluation, as well as other guidance on good practice in international development. Before we get started, I just want to flag to you that we're also going to be having another webinar a week from tomorrow with the CGIAR, which will be presenting its work on how it's integrated scaling into its research and innovation work on agri-food systems, and have three fantastic speakers from there. And for those of you who haven't gotten an invitation, there's a hybrid conference taking place this coming weekend, actually, in Paris, about launching our campaign for integrating and centering scaling into international development over the next 5 years. We think the current crisis in international development following the closing of USAID is certainly a tragedy, and many people are suffering around the world from the lack of services, as well as those who've been laid off. But at the same time, an opportunity to focus on scaling and how to make the money we still have as effective as possible. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ben, who will make the presentation, and followed by his colleagues. Thanks a lot, all of you, Ben and Manuela and Toon, for making the time. And I do just want to add that the Scaling Community of Practice did play an advisory role in developing this guidance, and we couldn't have had better partners in doing so. Ben and his colleagues were just absolutely outstanding, and very grateful for the opportunity to work with them. Ben, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Good afternoon from Paris, everyone. Just a quick check if you can hear me well. Maybe Manuela or Toon, can you just raise a thumb? Perfect. It's a pleasure being here, and especially being here with trusted colleagues, including Manuela and Toon, and of course you, Richard, and the Global Community on Scaling Development Outcomes. I'll introduce my fellow speakers in a second. Allow me to just say hello from the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate again. My name is Benjamin. I'm leading a team that works on innovation and now also on digital transformation for the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC. The DAC brings together 32 OECD member countries and the EU to set standards on development cooperation, to track official development assistance. And we, as the Development Cooperation Directorate, are the secretariat, and we provide support function also on a number of substantive issues, from gender equality, climate change, governance, well, to innovation and digital transformation. I've worked as the head of innovation at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office before, and I led the UNDP Innovation Facility. I teach as an adjunct professor at Columbia University and some other universities. That's me in a nutshell. Now, I want to briefly introduce the topic before I hand over to Manuela, and then also introduce Manuela. And to do so, I will use a few visuals. Gabi, could you pull up the slides, please? Now, we are talking today to members of the Global Community of Practice on Scaling Development Outcomes, and potentially a little bit of a wider network. But my strong assumption is that I don't have to make the case why is it important to focus on scaling in this forum. I do, however, quickly want to outline, and on the slide you can see 2 points. The first two that will resonate and that you're really well aware of, I'm certain of. But the third one is, a number of years ago, we convened our quite informal network of innovation leads among ministries and implementing agencies that are DAC members. And Manuela and Toon, as innovation leads, are members of that network, on the learning journey, several workshops related to scaling. And what became clear is that in a good number of ministries and agencies, reform efforts were underway to either address how programs are being designed, so really looking into small reforms on rules and regulations, program guidance. In others, the development of toolkits, and yet in others, the commissioning of studies to better understand what's the state of play within our institution when it comes to scaling. And there were a good number of our members within this innovation network that actually asked us, can you further support us? And at the same time, we saw quite some traction on scaling in OECD EvalNet. That's the formal network on development evaluation run by colleagues in my division, and in the results community of practice, bringing together colleagues who lead on results-based management. We then convened a reference group, inviting, so to speak, colleagues from all of these three OECD DAC networks to join the reference group. And here you see just an overview of the process with some of the big milestones for you to understand that colleagues such as Manuela and Toon really engaged heavily in reviewing a literature review we put together and then producing the scaling guidance. And for those of you who have looked into it, you can really see, and I mean, it's made very explicit, that this draws heavily on established evidence and existing toolkits, guidelines, and principles, including, of course, from the global community on scaling development outcomes. And fortunately, we also had members of the community as part of the reference group, as like special external experts going with us through the entire process. We had the policy guidance, which is legally non-binding, approved by the development committee in December. And we know really well that a DAC guidance does not change the world, does not change anything by itself. It's really now meant to provide kind of leverage for change agents within DAC member institutions, but also for downstream delivery partners to advocate for internal changes or to have a conversation with funders and saying, you as part of the DAC signed up to these principles and the policy guidance. Let's talk how you might fund us in a more systemic way to chip in on those scaling ambitions. And I really want to outline that the guidance is not limited to innovations. On the screen, you're now seeing a broad framing of development innovations as rather novel solutions, and what we framed as proven solutions, the large business as usual that development implementing agencies and ministries support. And we really saw so many similarities and developed our work in a way that is applicable to, so to speak, both, not exclusively to innovations. When it comes to scaling, there are many good definitions and framings out there, and we deliberately kept it rather simple and did not, for example, pick up what I personally think is a really good differentiation between scaling up, scaling out, and scaling deep, but kept it as high level as you can see with the definition we present in the guidance on scaling, to have as many of our target group agencies and ministries really work and embrace with it, because in a good number, as you can imagine, there is no formal definition, and making it kind of too conceptual would have not been beneficial from a practical viewpoint. And what we underline a lot when we speak with particularly senior managers, but also with practitioners who are rather new to this concept, is while scaling from the evidence base that we know takes quite a while, Manuela will speak to this, but more importantly, unlike some frameworks, and we use a lot the one developed by our partners, the International Development Innovation Alliance, which we contributed to, is not a linear process, as you all know so well, right? It's far from that, and it requires adaptation, investments in dark matter. And let me not go further, because more on the substance will come from Manuela. Now, before I hand over, I would love to introduce first Manuela and then later Toon. And Manuela is currently working as Research and Innovation Specialist at the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation at SDC. with a focus on scaling innovations for sustainable impact. In her current role, Manuela supports the transition of research findings and innovative solutions to impact at scale. And over the years, Manuela has contributed to embedding scaling practices within development organizations, facilitate dialogue and learning on scaling approaches. And as I mentioned, she was a really key member of the reference group for the DAC Guidance on scaling development outcomes. Manuela, I'm going to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And hello, colleagues. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to you about some key aspects of the new DAC scaling guidance. As Ben mentioned before, the document is really based on foundational work on scaling in international development. So we've drawn from various sources, including the Scaling Community of Practice, the International Development Innovation Alliance, IDRC, CHIR, and many more, and also from institutions within our own network, such as GIZ and former USAID. And the objective really was to build up on this existing evidence and to create a guidance document that is based on the common understanding of the DAC members and that is officially proved by the DAC also. That to say that first. And in terms of content, the DAC scaling guidance has 5 pillars, as you can see here on the slide. But no worries, I won't go through all of them one by one. But I'd like to focus on 3 dominant themes that are present in the guidance. It's a bit like red threads, if you want. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the first one. Thank you, Ben. So that is the importance of developing a long-term perspective and planning to phase out. And the text that you can see here on the slide comes directly from the scaling guidance. What we would like to point out here is that scaling takes time. So there are studies, particularly from the health and agricultural sectors, that suggest a time horizon between 10 and 15 years to be realistic. And in light of such time horizons, development organizations should not set out to scale a solution over its entire course in most cases. Because where most development work is delivered in time-bound projects, it is essential for any organization to critically consider whether it can and also whether it should realistically set out to scale a solution over such a long period of time. Rather, it should reflect on where in the scaling journey it has a comparative advantage. And that leads me right to the next point on the next slide, which is the importance of a viable business model. So in the guidance, we lay out that there are 2 main pathways for scaling, a commercial one and a public sector pathway. And while virtually all program design and evaluation guidelines across the DAC membership emphasize the notion of sustainability, there really is a clear lack in our sector when it comes to planning for viable business models. What we need to do is to assess how ODA can spark change and bring about proven solutions that provide value long after ODA funding ends. And as I said before, such viable business models can be profit-generating ones, or also solutions becoming part of public sector delivery, or hybrid ones even. I want to give one example here that pursues a pathway through the public sector. That's the Lively Minds initiative in Ghana and Uganda. So it's a program that operates in settings where education and play are often neglected due to parents' illiteracy and limited resources. And it trains parents in running educational play schemes for preschool children. In this program, catalytic investments and research help to assess the effectiveness and delivery cost of the interventions. And after these independent evaluations and also, much advocacy and behind-the-scenes work, of course, the program is now being delivered by the government in Ghana, at least in parts of the countries. It is yet to be fully rolled out nationwide, though, because there is a lack of funds in the education department in the country. But there is a clear ownership from the government, and that is what I wanted to point out here with this example. Then on the next slide, we have the last aspect that I want to emphasize on, and that really is a clear red thread that goes through the whole guidance. It's the support of local institutions and systems. So what we want to underscore here is that every solution, every innovation needs a clear line of sight to scale, and that really depends very much on local ecosystems. For instance, on the availability of financing along scaling stages, on conducive legislation, on existing networks, etc. So these are just a few. And I'm sure you know very well, all of you, that it's absolutely necessary to invest in understanding and in strengthening local systems. But yet, for many funders, such investments are rather hard to justify. So they tend to be intangible and also hard to quantify, and that makes them very difficult to communicate to relevant stakeholders, such as Parliament, as you can imagine. And this is a major reason why too often scaling is approached in a way that the scaling community of practice actually describes as transactional scaling in contrast to transformational scaling. And for those of you that are maybe not familiar with the concept, transactional scaling is usually about doing more. So having bigger projects, greater resources that cover more resources and more regions, more people, and actually mostly both. So it builds on a project view of development that focuses on disbursements, on intermediate outputs and outcomes within the project cycles. And success is measured by a project hitting the internal targets, like, for example, the numbers of beneficiaries. And as such, scaling often takes the form of replication. Then you have transformational scaling, on the other hand, which targets the size of the problem. So impact is measured in relation to the long-term targets and the scale of the problem. The initial focus is on creating the contextual and environmental foundations for scaling and viable scaling pathways. And there is a strong focus on creating local conditions that produce these desired outcomes. To give you an example here, take a bilateral funder that is supporting a research institution with developing a more drought-resistant rice variety. So after its viability is proven, the funder works on providing 10,000 small-scale farmers with access to the variety by providing financial support. A transactional way to scale this would be to provide more financial support, so another 10, 20, or maybe even 100,000 farmers would benefit from the subsidy and take up the improved crop variety. A transformational approach, however, would not spend the limited funds in such ways, but rather develop a theory of change that seeks to help shape local market conditions that lead to a situation that enables all small-scale farmers to purchase the new rice variety for a competitive price. And in our scaling guidance, we would call this systems practices. So basically, these are the three main elements that I wanted to present to you. And let me conclude with saying that I hope that this highlighted some major points and themes of the DAC scaling guidance. And have a look at the document itself, because you will discover much more, I promise. And yeah, we really created the guidance for DAC members, implementing agencies, as a useful reference for driving internal change. You can imagine this could be updating program and project guidance, designing, assessing, and also evaluating projects. And it's also supposed to help building a common understanding of scaling. And yeah, as a last comment, I really want to repeat what Ben already said, because it's such an important message, that we as a reference group, we really know very well that the DAC guidance in itself does not change anything. So we really encourage you and the whole community to explore the guidance further, use it to drive change and make a positive difference in your organizations and beyond. And with this, I hand back to Ben and the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Manuela. And before handing the mic over to you, Tun, just to say to all of you, a trusted colleague and team member as well of the reference group, Tun manages currently the Innovation Hub at Enable, the Belgium Agency for International Cooperation. In his current role, Tun supports the transition from innovative projects on a smaller scale to impact at scale, focusing very much on scaling with and through the public sector in domains such as education, healthcare, and agriculture. And Toon has a bioscience engineering background along with development studies and more than 10 years of experience working on the intersection of innovation and sustainability across Europe and Africa. Now, handing over to you, and just to let the audience know, we deliberately don't provide opportunities for Q&A now. We encourage you to note down reflections, questions, potentially challenge to us on the DAC guidance. And then we have a larger conversation once Toon has spoken. And I already saw one reflection from Andrea in the chat, and just want to outline that this question around demand was a key one that we worked on in the reference group, and we hope it's quite well reflected in the guidance. With that, over to you, Toon.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. And first of all, thank you for having me today. As Ben said, around 9 months ago, I joined Enable's Innovation Hub as a manager. After 5 years of working as an agricultural advisor and later as an innovation advisor, supporting Enable teams from the sidelines, I thought it was time to step into a more operational role. And I was very lucky to join a dynamic team of 10 passionate Enable colleagues right as they launched 4 new innovation programs following the first phase of a Belgian-funded initiative called We Habit. The We Habit program was one of Enable's very first dedicated innovation programs. It ran from 2018 to 2023 and supported scalable social innovations by launching thematic calls for proposals, which were aimed specifically at NGOs and non-commercial actors, which we considered as being often overlooked in the innovation space. We Habit was a grant-making facility offering grants from 300 to 350,000 euros, designed to help promising pilot projects transition from pilot to impact at scale. Some of the We Habit supported projects include AirCo, implemented by Makerere University in Uganda, using low-cost sensors to monitor air quality in African cities, and hereby trying to influence clean air policies across the continent. Another project was Medicaps from Physicians for Human Rights, who deployed mobile technologies to document cases of sexual violence and help victims and law enforcement officers in making a case. Now, what does scaling actually mean in this context? This was actually a question which kept on popping up. So our Enable team actually decided to launch an external evaluation and compiled all their internal reflections. And what we learned from those evaluations was that, while We Habit did indeed make a unique and valuable contribution, it operated in a niche, supporting non-profit innovations, often in underrepresented geographies, fostering peer learning between projects, which was all deeply appreciated by grantees. But aside from this overall positive evaluation, 4 key takeaways emerged. First of all, we saw that many innovations were actually replicating rather than scaling. We saw social innovators often doing the same pilot elsewhere, but finding it very difficult to actually go beyond that piloting phase. Second is that we as Enable, we lacked a common language and framework to guide and evaluate scaling efforts. And this made it for us very hard to compare approaches, measure scaling success, or adapt strategically. Thirdly was that there was still a problem with post-project sustainability. We saw that many of the initiatives that we supported actually were struggling when funding ended, without having clear strategies to continue growing. And lastly, related to our specific target audience, we saw that many of the nonprofit models face unique challenges around financial sustainability. The absence of clear revenue models made this continued scaling very difficult without continued donor support. So given these experiences, we were actually very eager to contribute to the development of the scaling guidance, this initiative led by Benjamin and so many other enthusiastic innovation leads across our sector. So we felt that when contributing to the scaling guidance, that this guidance should definitely reflect real-world insights. So we invited several of our former grantees, including local partners from Burkina Faso, from Uganda, and from Morocco, to review and shape the document, which we think actually is reflected in the document as it is right now. And for us, today, this scaling guidance has become both a tool and a compass in the work we do. It actually gives us a common language, because when we talk about innovation, or we talk about, even in our sector, about international cooperation, there is a lot of jargon and a lot of buzzwords going on. And at least we have now a common reference that we can use in order to create a common language when we talk about innovation and scaling. And second, it helps us also structure our support and align expectations with our grantees. And we have now embedded this approach across 4 new programs, 4 new innovation programs, 1 funded by Belgium and 3 funded by the EU. And across these programs, we try to actually use the scaling guidance both as a tool and a compass. And what we do is actually based on 3 pillars. We're still a grant-making facility, so we still offer financial support. We still focus a lot, and we actually strengthen this component of peer learning across different grantees. And we focus both on support and learning. This learning approach has become much more important than before, where we actually help and support our grantees in really identifying their learning questions, setting up experiments, and focus on this evidence-based learning in order to scale. And as you see in the picture here, this is a picture taken 2 months ago, when we actually convened all of our grantees for a 4-day workshop in Kampala to actually promote this peer learning and sharing of experiences across grantees working on different scaling projects in different sectors. Now, we as Enable, we are still in a learning mode ourselves, and we are actually trying to implement or use a scaling guidance, but we don't do this alone. We work a lot with partners, and we try to build on what others have already done. We are currently partnering with, for example, Brink and with the scaling experts of the CGIAR. And we are testing actually how to best support scaling in often complex and resource-constrained environments. So what we are currently focusing on together with our grantees are the following 3, I would say, main priorities. One is around business model innovation and development, trying to actually support our grantees in looking into revenue models, alternative revenue models that can actually help them scale. Second is working with and through governments. Many of the grantees we are supporting are actually looking at government adoption as one of the scaling pathways. And we actually want to help them better work with and through governments by aligning their communication, their ways of partnering with public actors. And third is data governance and responsible technology, the use of data, the collection of data, the use of data, and how to use it more responsibly. These are just 3 of the priority topics that we currently work on with our grantees. But of course, we still face some challenges, and I think one of the key challenges we still struggle with, or we still think is very present, is the public funding's risk aversion. Scaling innovations means embracing uncertainty, and that's often at odds with how taxpayers' money is managed, how decisions are being made, and how tools are being used in order to deploy taxpayers' money, with all the reporting requirements and due diligence requirements that come with it, and that often are considered quite heavy by our partners. Now, if we look ahead, we see 2 key priorities. First is, again, referring to the scaling guidance, working on referrals and capacity building. We still notice that there's still a lot of work to do to better prepare our grantees for follow-up funding, to help them actually meet the expectations of other public or private funders that could actually come after our funding and our partnership ends. To actually make sure that the pilot project or the scaling project that we're actually supporting now can lead to building real scaling capacities within these organizations. And second is by creating a stronger ecosystem, by actually building much more on the learnings that other agencies, other donors have been built up, working on a shared agenda around scaling social innovations, so we can build on each other's efforts. And one of the ideas we're currently exploring is to convene in Brussels in the second half of 2026, a kind of scaling event, a scaling forum, where we could actually convene and bring together like-minded donors and agencies to actually build upon each other and make sure we can create much more synergies and complementarities between our different approaches. And on this note, I will probably close, and just to say that as we experience, scaling isn't just about providing funding or technical assistance. Many of the bright innovations that we have been supporting, they need years to go from a promising pilot to impact at scale. And we truly believe we do need frameworks, we do need a common narrative, a common language. But in these times, in these difficult times, I would say, it's even more meaningful to create partnerships and to look beyond our own organizations and to continue building on each other's efforts. So I think this is a very timely webinar, and I'm really looking forward to learn more about what you're all doing.
Of course, if you work at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate and you work with amazing colleagues helping you produce an OECD output, then the real, so to speak, joy is to see that it's useful for colleagues. I think that is really chipping in on, well, our mission. So thanks a lot for sharing. Exciting work in my perception. And let me not talk much further, but hand the mic back to Richard for facilitating a conversation with participants, with colleagues who are online, with, again, either questions on the scaling guidance or on Enable's work, reflections or challenges. Richard, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. I really appreciate everybody's presentation. I think the three of you, particularly Toon and Manuela, were unusually frank about some of the challenges. And while we're waiting for some more questions to pop up in the chat, I thought I'd start with a couple of questions of my own. Toon, you raised this issue of scaling social innovations. And well, actually, this is to both, all of you, of scaling social innovations. And and the challenge is, on the one hand, that they don't have business models, they don't have earned income. And on the other hand, that in many countries, especially these days in sub-Saharan Africa, with unfortunately the emergence of yet another debt crisis, public resources are very limited. So I'm wondering if any of the three of you, because I know, Manuela, you've given some thought to this too, is there a third path? And perhaps maybe we need to just throw my own view on this in there. Is there, for example, rather than thinking about scaling innovations per se, in the narrow sense of the word, changing the conversation, changing public perception of what's normal or not normal, changing the paradigm. For example, I know a lot of you, DAC donors are funding work in non-traditional agriculture, like organic agriculture, conservation agriculture, agroecology, etc. Even though in most countries the norm is often petrochemical intensive. It's not clear whether that might go to scale per se, but by doing these kind of things, can we change the way, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture thinks about these things, which may not scale up a particular innovation, like a particular approach, but might, over the medium run, allow for many innovations in that space to go to scale. So without further ado, Manuela, maybe could I call on you first? If you're, well, whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
I can go first, and I'll hand over to my colleagues. Yeah, we've been touching upon this also a lot when we're discussing in the reference group. Like, really the importance of ecosystems, of systems practices. So not just concentrating on innovation, on scaling, but really building the environment, the conditions that enable our partner countries to drive such changes, and we can contribute a lot. So, you know, really listening to the demands, building strong networks with diverse partners, also bringing in different partners that we're maybe not used to in our traditional development work maybe, and think how we can collaborate in different ways. And that's also one aspect that we wanted to bring in with the guidance, but what I think we should think and discuss a lot more in the community of all colleagues working in our space.
Toon, you want to go here?
Yeah, sure. I think you made a very good point, Richard. And I think, first of all, not every problem has a profitable business case, and not even if you look at many of the often resource-constrained environments that we work in. But I think it's a matter of, first of all, looking at who is willing to pay for what added value that some of those social innovators are creating. Well, in some cases, this can be unusual suspects. I give you an example. We have currently two of our grantees, two NGOs that with whom we will launch a kind of exercise together to look into commercializing part of their social innovation and really tapping into a new customer segment, those who are actually willing and able to pay. And one of them has developed an e-health application, and they're actually now looking at ways. Is there a way for them to tap into actually customers, which for them is a totally new field, which could help them create revenue streams to actually fund part of their more traditional NGO work. And the other one is actually an agricultural NGO who's sitting on piles of data and looking at ways to valorize those data again to fund part of their other work. And I think there might be still a lot of, I think, untapped types of business models that before actually NGOs were not considering, because many of them, and I must also say many of the international NGOs we worked with, their funding streams have been quite traditional through donors or through quite reliable funders. But in the current context, most of them, are also kind of forced even to look at the alternative models. That's one thing. And second is, I think there's also the part of, I totally agree with you when you say, well, we need to look at scaling innovations in a different way. And I think still too often we look at scaling innovations as continuing organizations to do exactly the same thing they were doing. But really look at how can we actually create impact instead of just scaling any solutions that we have. And I think the example I gave from ERCO, which is an initiative from Makerere University, who developed a very low-cost air quality sensor, their objective is actually to influence clean air policies in different African cities around the continent. Their objective is not to sell low-cost air quality sensors. So actually, they are just trying to use the data they generate to influence those policies. And actually, they already did quite successfully in Kampala. So it's a matter of working towards solving certain issues, trying to contribute meaningfully to a certain social issue, without being stuck into this idea of just replicating a very solution-wise approach.
I'm happy to go, and I see that Martin has his hand up, and I think there are really interesting contributions in the chat. And just in quick reply to Nora, yeah, we looked quite a bit into unintended consequences and power dynamics, had to take some text out, it's a consensus document, but we definitely discuss this and think this monitoring for negative unintended consequences is so important. Let me reply quickly by zooming out, and I think that speaks a bit to Bertha's point, which I think is well formulated in the chat. And I want to push back on what you said, Richard, not because I think you're wrong, but I think that sometimes it's not a either or decision. The way I understood you and the way I think it makes sense for us to think about demand is not the laser focus on a potentially scalable innovation or solution, but thinking about where's an innovation gap. The other day, I spoke to the International Trade Center, an entity that has a new strategy and is really deliberate in about we have these sub-goals. And for each sub-goal, we think we have main building blocks in place to chip in on our objectives. But for some, we have to innovate, right? And that's different forms of innovation, some really pertaining to the way the organization works and some in implementation partner countries with partners. But essentially starting with a certain look on demand, be it on the organizational level or from the look of the government, right? And, you know, I like to challenge myself and colleagues when we like throw out these big words such as transformation or paradigms, but let's take the example of paradigm shift that you said, Richard, you know, of an education system. You have a formal education system in a certain country. And usually the main objective, like the paradigm of a system, is to enhance educational outcomes, which then feeds into economic productivity and competitiveness. And you could argue, you know, with the advent of the fourth industrial revolution and the need for people to constantly learn, that the paradigm should shift and the formal education system should not look at how can we enhance educational outcomes of students who are part of the formal system, but how can we enable lifelong learning that is relevant for our economy for all citizens, be them students or adults who are out of formal institutions. And if you advocate for such a paradigm shift, that translates into very different activities and investments from the government, Ministry for Education, and development partners. And this could be framed as, you know, the directionality of STI investments or mission-oriented innovation. And we work to this. And then you think about what do different organizations do, where there are gaps and innovation needs. And in the ideal world, and we see some promising emerging practice, you then have governments who appoint like a mission portfolio manager to look at the different interventions that different organizations have in place and tries to coordinate, and why not invest in competing solutions, but see what works, which can be scaled up. We've reflected a bit on this in a recent publication. I sent the link. But going back to my not either or, and then I'm going to stop speaking. Manuela spoke about Lively Minds, right? Lively Minds is a non-tech, what I perceive innovative intervention in Ghana, really targeting marginalized communities and families and their children. And I think such an innovation would have been probably not part of like a governmental mission on enhancing educational outcomes or enabling lifelong learning. It's really something specifically for marginalized children, and it also benefits their parents, by the way. Therefore, I think it's not either or, right? Like not either start with the big demand formulated by government or by the organization, but also kind of constantly looking for particularly what are community-led solutions, right? What is based on indigenous wisdom and has good evidence for impact, or we can help them produce such evidence and see if it's kind of scalable, but not kind of opening up such a duality. Sure, we should start with the demand, but there's an opportunity also for solution search. Now I've talked enough. Back to you.
Thanks a lot. Those were really super helpful. Let me ask the following question. I want to pick up on something that Manuela mentioned in her presentation. I may not characterize what you said, Manuela, correctly, so please feel free to correct me, but I think you raised the issue of risk. And I think one of the reasons that many funders and donors focus on short-term transactional scaling and projects is, okay, you know, we spent $1 million of our taxpayers' money and 100,000 people benefited. Whereas if we spend the same amount of money on preparing the preconditions for scaling using a transformational approach, first of all, at least in the first few years, there's not a lot of impact to show for it. And secondly, it's probably more risky because if you're to target, you know, reaching 1 million or 5 million or 10 million or the entire population that needs this, obviously the chances of success are a little bit lower. Now, if you do that 10 times, you know, 2 projects that hit 50 million people successfully and 8 fail versus 10 projects that hit 50,000 people, obviously the impact's bigger, but I'm not sure there's an appetite in most bilaterals or others for an aggregate success, but a lot of individual failure. Maybe I've mischaracterized it or the question right, but I guess could you talk about, you know, how your institutional incentives to show results, to show the money's been well spent, might present challenges for taking a more transformational approach, and if you have any suggestions how to address that. I hope I didn't put you guys on the spot, but I think it's a question we get a lot, and you guys are extremely thoughtful. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what I see in my daily work when I speak to our partners, which are implementing agencies, you know, they always, there's always a bit the notion of, you know, the funder wants to see impact, and that's why we can't do innovation, because we cannot take this risk because it's the funders' money that we're spending, etc. So it's like kind of they're telling us, and then we're kind of in the same situation because we have to be accountable towards our own money donors, which is the government and the parliaments. So we're always in a cascade of, you know, having to show our results, our impact, and then in the end the question is who actually defines what the impact is. It can take so many so many forms depending on your perspective, on who you are, on what you want to achieve. And yeah, I think that's just the sphere that we need to navigate in. Innovation is always about risk taking. We're always talking a lot about failure, and that, you know, failing fast in order to, you know, not spend taxpayers' money on things that don't work. But in the end, I mean, it's all about learning. And I really think that scaling is a lot about learning. And if we continue our work in this spirit, we will be able to prove that we haven't failed in the end, but that we made major steps. But maybe my colleagues have more concrete solutions to address these challenges.
Well, happy to continue what Manuela also said. I think indeed, and it was me, by the way, who said that for us it's still one of those challenges that we see. We are an implementing agency. If we the type of, I think, funds that our donors are willing to commit to innovation is not per se growing, and we see the time frames are getting shorter. They want more concrete results on a shorter time frame, and very tangible results. And often, if you work in innovation, that's a very difficult kind of story to tell. And at some point, there is a need to embrace a certain level of risk appetite, to willing to invest in still uncertain outcomes. That's one thing. So I think it's also up to us. And one thing we do, for example, is we try to go into discussion with our donors. We have the Belgian government, and I think one of the things that really helped was actually together with our DAC delegates, which is at the Ministry of Development Cooperation. We actually were in close discussion when we were contributing to the scaling guidance, and actually it was one of those occasions where we had the opportunity to really go into a deep discussion with our ministry and actually explain the why we think it's important to invest in innovation, because there's still a lot of, I think, room to actually explain why we are doing what we are doing. And second is also, I think, on our side, to just get better at managing innovations and supporting innovations. I think there is still a lot that, and I look at Enable, where we can learn in ways to better do portfolio management, to actually better manage the risks that are associated with innovation, because no donor actually wants to see an implementing agency just make big bets and invest big sums of money in without having a solid innovation and learning approach around it. So it's actually for us also to keep on investing in learning approaches, in innovation approaches that can help us actually manage those risks better, working much more on evidence-based learnings, on evidence-based innovation, to go towards the stage gate process where we start with kind of smaller ticket sizes for more uncertain or more risk-prone initiatives, and then increase according to the when innovations become a bit more mature. I think there's still a lot to do also on our side, but it's a work in progress, and I think it's one of those things that we as when I say we, agencies and actors that are working in the sector, need to continue working on and continue kind of tell our story and explain the why of what we are doing.
That's great, thank you. There was a question in the chat about what I would call donor coordination or collaboration from Bertha, whose last name I'm not going to try to pronounce because I'll mangle it. And she highlights the issue of there seems to be a fair issue of a lack of coordination and to some extent repetition, which is, you know, everybody, or not everybody, but several donors will identify a particular, what Ben just referred to, I guess, as an innovation gap or scaling gap, but without working together, you know, we'll fund projects or innovations efforts to research and innovation efforts to address it. I guess I'd like to ask a three-part question, and feel free to answer any of the three parts. First of all, I think this issue of multiple, well, certainly it's great to have multiple innovations in this space. What more can be done to avoid repetition and increase coordination there? For example, one of the scaling criteria that we use in the SCOP is, why is this better than what else is out there? But you often don't see in a scope of work or in a decision to scale something a systematic or even partial review of to answer that question. What else is out there and why is this better? Is that partly because of resources? Is there internal incentives to, you know, the Swiss agency wants to see its stuff go to scale? I don't mean to pick on the Swiss, but when I used to work with USAID, I've been to conferences on scaling best practices in, let's say, maternal health, and shockingly, 90% of the innovations were USAID financed. And while I think USAID used to do good work, I'm not sure that 90% of the innovations out there were once financed by USAID. So how do we address this repetition or replication or lack of coordination issue, and particularly, you know, partnering together to figure out what is good out there, and can we jointly support that in terms of scaling? And I guess that leads into the larger question, which is that a lot of innovation units within organizations like the two of you represent have fairly small budgets. How do they find or connect with, whether it's what we call the mothership, you know, the larger part of Enable, the Swiss part of the Swiss agency that does projects, or work with other bilaterals or multilaterals, whomever, to scale projects? So the narrow question about coordination and avoiding repetition on finding best innovations, and the larger question of coordination and support for scaling more generally, given limited resources. Maybe I'll start with you, Ben, just because you haven't spoken, if you have anything to say, and then go around the room, go around the virtual room.
I want to keep it short, as there are really good points in the chat, and maybe colleagues want to, I'm not sure, Richard, if you allow this, kind of come on mic and share. Just want to say, great point. We don't have this solution, but what we really emphasize with the funders is be prepared to play a part in a scaling pathway and to phase out, to hand over, as both other speakers really outlined before. You know, come at it with some storytelling craft and not the hero mentality of we have to scale. Very often that's just a not realistic expectation for many reasons that I think are obvious. And that includes not always one institution has all the necessary financing instruments, right? Or even the capability to operate something at scale. I'll keep it as short as that. And yeah, thanks everyone for putting things in the chat. I'm curious to hear from a couple of other more participants. And Maybe I hand it back to, well, let me hand it to Manuela for a response.
Yeah, what you were saying, Richard, really resonates to me. You know, it's all about people in the end, and bringing our solutions to our own organizations already is a challenge. We do fund research projects that bring out really relevant results with good, that have proven successful. And then it's all about connecting the dots already within our own organization, so that our own divisions, be it regional, geographic divisions or thematic divisions, can take actually the results of the innovative solutions that we come up with. And then we really need to, do more and connect to our colleagues who are maybe sitting right next to us, or that we can just call up, pick the phone and call them, and we should do this a lot more. And, you know, taking this small example of our own organizations, it's the same with the whole community out there. Really connect to the colleagues and speak to them, and use each and every opportunity to learn about what the others are doing, and trying to find the dots and connect them. That's what I would contribute to your question.
Toon, did you have something you wanted to add on this, or can I ask another question?
No, just quickly, and maybe on a more positive note, I think the lack of coordination is true, but I think we also see a lot of good initiatives happening, especially I think we as Enable, we're quite decentrally organized. So most of our teams are in our country offices, but what we see is at country level, there's a lot of sector level groups. So there is a lot of dialogues between different agencies, between donors, and I think it's happening pretty well at country level, to my understanding. And second, if we look at mainstream, or how to actually connect with the mothership in terms of budgets, well, within Enable, again, it's just an example, but we are two, let's say, full-time, two colleagues full-time employed or dedicated to innovation. I'm dealing with the innovation hub, so it's innovation projects. But my colleagues, Alize, she's working on mainstreaming innovation. So she's actually integrating innovation in our thematic and our country portfolios.
Oh, wow.
And actually tackling the innovation question by relating to some of when it's a program around education, really around the topics we're working on. So sometimes it's also a matter of, I think, selling the innovation approach without talking about innovation, but talking about how can we accelerate impact, how can we actually accelerate, testing, experimenting, new promising approaches, etc. And sometimes you take it out, I think, of the innovation space with all the jargon and all the expectations that come with it. And to our understanding, it works pretty well. And when we talk to colleagues, often we even avoid using the words innovation or scaling and try to connect with what makes sense for them.
Sometime in the future, we can have your colleague on and give a presentation about her effort. I think it was her efforts, how they're going, even if it's early days, either what's happened or what they're trying to do. I guess I'm going to try to sneak one last question in, because I think the audience will be very interested in this. My understanding is that the group that you're all working with at the OECD DAC and DCD has on its agenda promoting innovation systems in the Global South. And I was curious if any of you could say a little bit more about that, and particularly how you're thinking about integrating scaling into that, so that it's not just innovation systems, but innovation and scaling systems. My personal perspective is at least traditional approaches like hackathons, incubators, accelerators have had limited success, especially because the second or third or fourth stage funding is so limited in those countries. And so whether you're in the early days about just what your agenda is or what you're working on, maybe again, since maybe I could start with you, Benjamin.
I'm so sorry. Let's hand over to another speaker, because I'm responding to Rosa in the chat and I did not pay sufficient attention. I'm so sorry.
Toon, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, happy to give some first reaction. I think indeed what we what I notice the same thing. So when we talk about support to innovation, very quickly we talk about like incubation programs, innovation challenges, hackathons, etc. And I think, well, to my experience, the more successful cases, they come from, I would say, ecosystems where you have a number of institutions that are actually there also to support those initiatives. If you just do them without working through the institutions, through the ecosystem itself, and without supporting, reinforcing the ecosystem, it's very difficult to my experience, to my modest experience, to make them a success. And I think these often relate to these kind of innovation approaches that are often inspired by let's say, a very Western or Euro US centric approach or idea about innovation, that you just need to put out a challenge and some funding, and then the innovations will come and spread themselves. But we as Enable, we work a lot in I would say underrepresented region. We don't work in Kenya, we don't work in Nigeria, we don't work in Ghana, we don't work in South Africa. We work in the Sahel region, in Western Francophone Africa, in Central Africa. And there we try to combine, if we do these kind of initiatives, with, I would say, really strengthening and working with the actors in the ecosystem. And to my understanding, that's the only way to make these things work.
Manuela?
No, I agree. I really think we go in the right direction with concentrating on ecosystems. And as you said before, the DAC group on innovation, the I33 group, is concentrating on the ecosystems work at the moment. And I think it would be good if Ben could share some elements on what the group is planning, because he can know much better than I do.
Thanks. Yeah, continuation of our work on scaling is now a 9-month long in-depth learning journey on innovation and research ecosystems, with this kind of basic insight: every innovation, every solution needs a line of sight to unfold impact at scale. That line of sight is nested in local ecosystems. And a good number of funders have dedicated programs to strengthen ecosystems, and many funders struggle with, challenges around how to diagnose ecosystem, its strength and areas for improvement, how to develop monitoring and evaluation frameworks, how to work well with national partners, going back to the demand question. So we had a kickoff seminar and have now a list of 8 priority topics, and we'll convene our informal community of practice on these topics. The invite will go out tomorrow to our innovation leads, such as Toon and Manuela, for the next 9 months. And if any participants online is interested in this, and you're also a funder, I think that's really important, or you have real dedicated work on ecosystem strengthening, then please reach out to me, as we are now kind of lining up also external colleagues to provide insights, to engage with us. Some of them will be seminars, other will be real workshops, like hand-on, getting into the M&E kind of thick of things. And yeah, with that, I'm going to hand back over to you, Richard.
All right. Well, we're a little bit over time, but I thought this was an incredibly great webinar. I think it's really exciting what the collaborative effort that the 3 of you represent has produced, and we're really looking forward to more news from you all, both about how individual and collectively the bilaterals that are part of this effort are trying to take the guidance and integrate it into their own operations, perhaps foreshadowing future webinars, whether from STC, Enable, if not Toon, maybe as colleagues, and maybe other bilaterals. I think the work that you just outlined, plan on the innovation ecosystems, Ben, is incredibly exciting. I think many of us will be waiting impatiently. 9 months seems like forever, but I understand it takes time to do the work. But we really look forward to what you'll be sharing. And may I suggest for those of you, I think Benjamin maybe can post in the chat how to stay tuned to developments, perhaps his LinkedIn account or the DAC's Innovation LinkedIn account. I'm not sure how to stay in touch with that. As you know, saw Gabby posted in the chat, we do have another webinar a week from tomorrow with the CGIAR that Toon mentioned that they're working very closely with. The CGIAR webinar will talk about a tool that they're using on getting innovation scaling ready, which I think is a very critical issue. It'll also talk about this issue of portfolio management, which we touched on today. And last but not least, it'll describe a very interesting $200 million 5-year plan, that a program that the CGIAR has to scale its own innovations and partner. Well, actually, let me be careful with my words, to facilitate the scaling of the many innovations that the CGIAR has developed with financial and other support and cooperation from Enable and other donors. So please attend, and also Gabby posted the hybrid event we're having in Paris this coming weekend. If we don't see you at either of those events, I wish all of you who listened a fantastic summer. We will have more events lined up for the fall. And thanks again to the three of you for taking your incredibly valued time and sharing. Again, one of the things I love so much about working with you guys is how honest you are. You don't paint the rosy picture. You're positive, but you also, confront the challenges. And I think this kind of healthy conversation about what we're doing well and where we need to move forward and the challenges we face really will serve us all incredibly well. So thank you all so much for your time and your effort and the incredibly hard work you're doing. I know how hard you guys work, and it's much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
All right, everybody.